We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we are running the gamut on everything political and cultural. It's going to be quite the show. Please remember, Liberty Nation Radio is sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides. We're very fortunate to have with us Independent Women's Forum Policy Analyst and Engagement Coordinator, Neeraja Deshpande.
Thank you so much for having me.
So today we're here to talk about a new report that came out this week, and this is based on the issues with education and how essentially the massive red tape is stifling, if not throttling, what's happening in terms of education and the ability of teachers to actually be educators. Would you give us an overview of what you've discovered?
So unfortunately, often what we see in the news are a couple of different stories, right? One, which is that schools are falling apart, behavior's getting worse, stress scores are dropping, COVID was really a big killer for a lot of schools. You hear that story. And then on the other hand, you hear all these political battleground stories, right? So you hear conservatives often saying, oh, teachers are, pushing ideology on kids, or teachers are doing this, or, like they're teachers are the ones who are just sort of making classroom teaching worse, and they're making, test scores drop. And you also have liberals saying, oh, no, teachers are perfect, unions are great, everything is fine, and what we just need is more money. And so none of these stories really, the political battleground stories don't really help the actual issues on the ground. So at Independent Women's Forum, what we thought was, a lot of teachers, there are some ideologically crazy teachers, right? We're not talking about bad teachers, but most teachers are good teachers and they're really in it for the kids. So we sort of thought, okay, well, that part of what conservatives often say about teachers isn't really making a lot of sense, but the liberal story doesn't really work either, right? It's not money. We've seen throwing money at a problem doesn't often make it any better. And throwing sort of money at this problem has in many cases just made it worse. COVID, skyrocketed the funding for schools, and essentially we got negative results. We got worse results. So we sort of thought, okay, well, what are other things that are stifling teachers from actually being able to do their jobs, right? So, finding some potential common ground between liberals and conservatives, but also, talking just about the bureaucracy and the red tape that's really hurting teachers in classrooms in a way that, most people don't really talk about. People talk about all these other, side issues, but not the issues that matter, which is that often teachers just literally are not able to do their jobs because of the sheer amount of bureaucracy they have to navigate. And that bureaucracy comes from the federal government, that bureaucracy comes from the state government, and that bureaucracy often comes from local governments and districts themselves.
Yeah, it is. It's an unbearable burden in many ways, because as you rightly point out, the problem with the idea that what's needed is more money for the situation is we've seen year on year the amount of money spent on education goes up, and this is a worldwide phenomenon. It's not just specific to the United States, but we've seen the amount of money increase and the results, the tenable results actually go down. It's almost like an inverse proposition on what they're getting there. But then, of course, as you point out rightly, from the right side, a lot of the blame is being put on the ideology being taught in the classroom, which is, of course, happening in many instances, but not in all instances. And yet, that it seems like that's a very small aspect of the larger problem. That is, there are 80,000 administrators for every teacher. Obviously, that's an exaggeration in the numbers. So what's the solution to cutting back on this administrative load?
Administrative load is part of it, certainly. And I think there's just, first of all, you look as big as possible, right? You look at the federal government. And so we looked at federal student policies that were just throttling teachers in various respects. So one policy that, we analyzed was was about student behavior. So one thing that happened during the Obama administration is that student behavior turned into this very political battleground over racial issues, right? The Obama administration sort of framed it as, okay, if you're disciplining, too many kids who aren't white, you must be guilty of racism, which is kind of a silly proposition. But the Obama administration sort of made that the law of the land via a Dear Colleague letter, which is sort of a Department of Education.
Let's put that in quotes. Dear,
Yeah,
the dear colleague letter, yes.
So what that really means is if you don't do what we're telling you to, we're going to defund you, right? And they immediately sort of went after Milwaukee public schools. They sort of threatened a lot of different school districts. And the end result was that actually in 2018, by which point Trump was president and the Parkland shooting happened, it turned out that a lot of the policies that were recommended by the Obama administration in 2014 contributed to the Parkland shooter just being able to run free. So it wasn't that the school district in Florida had followed Obama's policies, but Obama's policies were actually modeled off of the school district in Florida, which is even crazier. So that shooting was really caused in part because Nicholas Cruz, the shooter, was literally able to go undetected because of policies that sort of said, okay, we're not going to discipline kids, basically. So Betsy DeVos, then Secretary of Education, revoked that Dear Colleague letter, but a lot of the damage was done by that point. Biden comes back in and says, gives kind of a vague advice. It's not nearly as strong as the 2014 Obama letter. But actually last week, Trump just, put in an executive order really designed to bring order back to classrooms and saying, yeah, actually, there needs to be discipline at the school level. So hopefully that's something that does benefit. But we were basically saying that, this sort of one of the recommendations that we make is that this sort of federal chaos where the guidance is changing every 4 years, depending on which party's in power, is really not sustainable. So there needs to be, more stable action taken. Also on state level, sometimes school discipline policies are just crazy, right? There are states like Connecticut, which effectively stop suspensions. Like you can't really give an extended suspension, right? You can't really give an extended expulsion in a state like Connecticut, which is a huge problem when it comes to really disruptive kids in the classroom, and they're often disturbing students who do want to learn, and there's just disrupting teachers from teaching.
There was, if I may just make it an aside here, there was a recent issue with prison guards. I think it was through New York State, and they were not allowed to use the most valuable punishment they have for the disruptive prisoners, and that was to put them in solitary confinement, which is, I guess that's the educational system equivalent of a suspension or an expulsion. And what happened was, once the prisoners realized that they can't do anything worse to me than what is already happening at this time, so there's no barrier, there's no pushback, there's no leash on being able to do whatever they want when they want, because there's no punishment at the end of whatever particular thing they're doing. And this seems to me the problem with the education system as well. If you allow such a laissez-faire approach to, well, we're not going to discipline you, we're not going to suspend you, we're not going to expel you, we're not going to even downgrade you for submitting work that's subpar because we have certain criteria in place, administrative burden. I know I keep coming back to that, but I've got the administrative burden.
True. I mean, that's what we're really focused on too.
Right. So how does, you mentioned that a lot of the problem is that there's an upheaval like every 4 to 8 years because there's a presidential transition, parties in power, and then there's a different focus. So how do you suggest maintaining a balance across the ideological bent that will inevitably transpire in the White House?
To really remove the federal government from education as much as possible, right? President Trump has already sort of gotten on that train by working toward dismantling the Department of Education, for instance. The federal role in education is just way too heavy. There's no reason some DC bureaucrat knows what's going on, in Wyoming or in California, for that matter. They might know what's going on in DC, but they're not going to have what relationship do they have with Alaska public schools, right? Yeah. There's almost none. So you sort of see that issue with the federal role in government. So getting it as out of education as possible is ideal. Obviously, there are places where the government does need to intervene, though, right? Like civil rights, I mean, even some of these executive orders reversing bad decisions, that's also kind of necessary, even if it is some amount of federal oversight. So there's always going to be a balance, but I think we've leaned way too much into that federal role, beginning with the Obama administration, and getting out of it as much as possible from both parties. Returning to sanity is really going to be what's best. And yeah, I mean, that's what I would say for the federal role.
A return to sanity by sending it back to the states. Where have I heard that before? We'll be back with Neeraja after this short break. Please don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.